Hawaii is often seen as both paradise and escape, not just in terms of vacations and honeymoons, but also in terms of racial formation and ethnic tension. Through the affirmation of Hawaii as a multicultural model, a place of not only ethnic tolerance but also equality, racial hegemony and ethnic inequality throughout the islands is quietly maintained. This documentary seeks to deconstruct this conception of Hawaii as a multicultural model and find ways to address issues of both racial and ethnic inequality.
Well, let's start with ethnicity. That can be defined different ways. I mean, academically, you could say as an organizing principle of social relations, as we talked about, in the same way that race is, class is, gender is, or are organizing principles. So that's one way.
There's different ways of understanding ethnicity. Sometimes there's the conflation between race and ethnicity, and people not really differentiating between them. There's also people who understand ethnicity as culture.
Another way would be as consisting of both identity and culture. So in terms of being Japanese American, that would be both my identity and that would be also the culture to some extent that I follow. Although I also follow the local culture in Hawaii too.
And ethnicity can be a whole bunch of different things, but I think common usage of it is really looking at your ancestry and looking at where you come from, and then everything else attached to it, particularly when it comes to culture, language, those kinds of things, values.
Well, Hawaii certainly has a reputation, nationally if not globally, as a setting for very tolerant, harmonious, egalitarian relations. This goes back a long way to the early part of the 20th century. The idea of Hawaii as the racial melting pot, the paradise of the Pacific, where people get along very well with each other. This is hardly the case, though, if we look at both history and the contemporary situation.
The other thing is there are differences, power differences between the different ethnic groups, and that's also something that we don't usually talk about. And you're in a place where you actually have Asian groups that have ascended to power, and I think that creates a different kind of dynamic. On a continent, you still have people wanting to, become big power players, whether it's in the political arena or an economic arena. In Hawaii, you have that, particularly with the Japanese and the Chinese, and now some with Koreans as well.
Historically, we can look at the domination of the immigrant plantation groups and Native Hawaiians. What happened to those groups? The many strikes they organized, which hardly is an indication that they accepted the situation as they found themselves in. In more contemporary terms, we can also look at the inequalities that exist among groups. The clear evidence of institutional discrimination that keeps Filipinos, Hawaiians, Samoans in very subordinate positions vis-a-vis Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, and whites as the dominant groups.
Issues of racism and those things become muted, because everyone has access. Everyone has, there are people who look like you who have access, and so it's hard to talk about structural racism when your communities are all over the structure. You know what I mean?
The absence of collective violence perhaps might give the impression that the groups do get along with each other, and also the very positive kinds of experiences one can have in Hawaii relating to people from another ethnic group than one's own at schools or at places of employment. Perhaps there's less of that kind of segregation that might take place in large cities on the U.S. continent. But this tends to obscure the ways we don't get along, especially at the societal level, where we find these clear indicators of ethnic inequality.
I don't know how many times at the university people have asked me to take out their trash for them, that kind of stuff.
I remember walking into the Ilikai Hotel and people kind of looking at me like, because back then I had really long hair, just like this, when I was young, and, I looked the role, you know what I mean? Whatever the role is, but I looked like I wasn't going to be walking into the Ilikai Hotel, and
Most of the images that are attached to Filipinos are negative. You also have the images of Filipinos being seen as criminally inclined, as being sexually predatory, all of these different things.
Then I started to realize just the makeup of the place, right? So parking the cars, there was like Samoans, Hawaiians, and dark people, big people. You get to the front desk and they look very East Asian, very pale, light skinned, young women. You go outside to the pool area, on your way up, and you see like entertainers, you know what I mean? People dancing and singing by the pool. Hawaiians or whoever else looks the role. And then you get up, you start to see maintenance facilities and like housekeeping, a lot of majority Filipino, so you start to see, stratification even within this one hotel in Waikiki.
Well, the kinds of examples I often cite for institutional discrimination have to do with the school system, the public school system, insofar as we find underfunding of the Department of Education schools. Most evident this past year, academic year, in the Friday furloughs. I consider this discriminatory, the closure of this public schools for 17 days the past school year, as institutional discrimination, because most of the public school students are from the minority groups. Hawaiians, Filipinos, Samoans, just those three groups are already a majority of public school students. So they're the ones who suffered the most from the closure of the schools.
But also, I think one thing in all of those celebrations that we tend to gloss over is what it means when all of this stuff is happening in an occupied place, right? And we have that diversity, that racial and ethnic diversity, because of the colonization of Hawaii, because of the dispossession of Native Hawaiians. The question then becomes, right, yeah, you celebrate all of that, but you also gotta contextualize it in a longer kind of history, and then what does that mean for how we understand ourselves and our rise to power as Asian Americans.
From the Native Hawaiian perspective, coming in, you also then you realize that there are different layers to this, right? So not only are Native Hawaiians displaced in their own homeland, you have this other type of racialization happening within the API community. It's kind of weird for me,
The hard part is then, what happens when the groups that don't have power, they start questioning it. And I think that's where we're at, where you actually have people that are being critical of the uneven power relations, and examining the kinds of consequences of the Japanese and Chinese ascendancy into power, and what that actually means for something like Asian America, or what that means for Native Hawaiian sovereignty.
The only politically active group in Hawaii are Hawaiians, through the sovereignty movement, trying to have their concerns, problems, issues addressed through their own community organizations. But that kind of political activism or even community activism to address issues of ethnic inequality is not really present in Hawaii, because we don't recognize it as a problem. Overall, substantial majority of people believe we live in a place where everybody gets along. So if you raise these kinds of issues, there's a way in which you can be criticized for playing the race card, let's say, or the ethnic card, drawing too much attention to the problems faced by your own group, and not being willing to recognize, let's say, acknowledge the value of living in Hawaii in this supposedly multicultural society. So those kinds of voices get silenced.
These images help to feed the kinds of inequities that we have here, right? They're an important part of, for some people, justifying how things are, right? And that's how things are, that's how things will always be, that kind of thinking. For me, what I want to do is be able to be critical of that kind of thinking, and for students, for my students to be able to unpack those kinds of ideas and to unpack those kinds of dynamics, and to see how it really impacts them, not only as like some kind of idea that's out there, but also how it impacts them in their everyday lives, and how they use these kinds of ideas to frame their interactions with people, to frame their understandings of people, and what kinds of consequences those things have on their lives.
Then I would hope I can contribute to changing people's attitudes towards how they view Hawaii. Not so much in those positive terms, but as a place where we do have our own problems concerning ethnic relations, continuing discrimination and racism, and hopefully people will try to mobilize themselves as a community to address these kinds of issues.